Wizards of the Coast released Unearthed Arcana 2022, the Cleric and Revised Species, alongside a blog post on D&D Beyond called Moving On from Race in One D&D. And in those documents, they basically stated that the term race would no longer be used in the next version of D&D and would be replaced by species. And I brought on two folks to talk to me about it. I got Emma and Jeremy, two important voices in this industry. Also, two people who worked as cultural consultants on similar projects as me. I figured that we just use this as a quick sort of reaction to what Wizards has done with this big change. And I say big change because it actually will bring up a lot of conversation. In the document, so in the Unearthed Arcana, they actually said that, and this is their current working definition of species, and it's worth noting that this is Unearthed Arcana. This is not set in stone. This isn't official. And they're actually going to be soliciting for feedback from the community, I think on December 21st, I believe is the actual date. So who knows? This could change. There is some stuff in this that was removed from the previous One D&D playtest material, particularly about that really weird and gross paragraph about mixed characters. They took that out completely. So they are listening, but hopefully they listen to this. Now, in this document, they basically say that a player character's species is the set of game traits that an adventurer gains from being one of those life forms. And in this, they specifically say sapient life forms from across the multiverse. Basically saying that, your upbringing, so like aspects of culture and training are represented by background and class. Now, in the previous sort of Unearthed Arcana 1D&D playtest material, they took the mechanical bonuses associated with attributes away from race, now species, and moved them into background, which is something that on the podcast we thought was actually a really good change. But I want to know from you two, what are your thoughts on species? We've talked on Discord, but let's start with you, Emma, because I'm expecting an anthropological answer, and I think I know what you're going to say, but I don't want to take those words.
I think we have similar things to say pretty easily, but my main problem is I love that they got rid of the term race, but species is not a great choice for a bunch of reasons. And yeah, like as Daniel said, not even anthropologically, just scientifically, even from biology and everyone else, species means a whole lot of different things, and there's no agreed upon definition of species amongst people who use this term and kind of came up with the term.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then anthropologically, I think we can all talk about the perception of the term species versus its actual use, and then what it'll actually do within the game. So I don't have to go off on all of that by myself.
Yeah, and I think we're going to actually dedicate a full episode of the podcast to it, but I want to know just like initial gut reactions. What about you, Jeremy? Like you are somebody who works as a TTRPG writer, cultural consultant, just like Emma and I. But you're not an anthropologist like we are. Like, what is your reaction to this?
My reaction is it's a bit of a interesting choice. I'm not exactly sure why they went with species and not ancestry, which is sort of becoming the default that a lot of other games are going to. The latest Critical Role book for 5th edition used ancestry. Jeremy Crawford says the term ancestry in one of the videos that was previously released where he's talking about race. It feels like they really want to use that term, and I'm not sure why they went with species instead. I mean, maybe it's because like Pathfinder uses ancestry and they want to differentiate themselves, but species seems it just seems like an unusual choice.
I have a little bit of a guess, can't say for sure.
Yeah,
but I'm wondering if they're trying to distance from, or it was proposed as a way to distance from some of the socio-cultural, political aspects. But because there's a general idea that if you use a more scientific term, it's somehow more objective and less problematic. But that's just not how it works.
But they picked a scientific term that doesn't have a general consensus as to what it actually means.
They were also like science isn't objective.
Of course, yeah.
there
I
are a
don't,
lot of
yeah,
issues.
I don't necessarily see it as like less problematic either, because I mean, I've been reading a whole lot of Robert E. Howard lately,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, that's
like
right.
his discussions, his letters with H.P. Lovecraft on like
Oh,
the
okay.
different races of the
Yeah.
world and how different, ethnicities are like subspecies or
Mhm.
inferior species, or, a primal barbarian species lurking under the earth that is pure and Aryan, and H.P. Lovecraft injecting his own thoughts into Robert E. Howard's theses to to make it even more racist. I don't necessarily think species is
No, it's not.
It's
any
not the
better
move.
But
than race.
that's what I'm saying. Like, it's
Yeah.
not. There is a lot of people in the public think that science is objective, and so using more scientific terms is probably safer or somehow technical, but it's not, because yeah,
Yeah,
there's no
absolutely.
single idea of what a species is, or how to define it, or how to actually apply it to living things that are constantly surprising us, and then applying it to like really complex living beings with really complex societies and cultures and everything else. So
Yeah, absolutely. I
the
mean, our understanding of living beings is so flexible and constantly changing. They pick the one term that is also constantly changing.
yeah, and I don't know, removing the word race doesn't remove what I would call like the racialization. So just because you don't say race doesn't mean we don't have the same problems. And species then adds some kind of icky like science aspect to that, where it was like some people thought that racial stuff was actually scientific and could be, outlined.
Are you
And
talking like eugenics, that sort of stuff?
Eugenics, like
yeah,
Yeah.
different ethnicities have different sizes of brains, and that's built.
Craniometrics.
Yeah, cranial metrics. That's
phrenology.
built
Yeah.
into the
Yeah.
genetic makeup of the species.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
saw somebody on Twitter basically said that like switching from race shows that Wizards is acknowledging the problem with the term race, but moving to species doesn't resolve like the underlying issue of like essentialism in D&D, and it just brings up different problems. It's like, hey, let's take one really problematic term and then replace it with another problematic term that's going to cause
Yeah.
other problems and maintain the exact same problems. I think like the one thing that really bothers me is that when people are like, "Oh, race is fine in D&D," the argument to justify the use of race in D&D and other like fantasy RPGs is that races are interpreted as different species. So it's like reinforcing the argument of the toxic aspect of the community by using this term. And then
Yeah.
they also give a very, very loose definition of what it is. So they're like, oh, it's like your species refers to the traits you get from being one of these life forms. So they're saying it's a biological thing right off the bat, But then they don't say, well, what do you actually mean by species? Because if you look at like Linnaeus is like, oh, typology and morphology. What do they look like? But then if you look at insects, like if you look at bees or if you look at ants, male and female ants, like the drones look completely different, right? They're still the same species, right? And then you go to like Ernst Mayr, who basically is like, well, what about reproductive isolation? Which is what most people will argue in D&D. But then that doesn't even line up, because what about like dogs and wolves? They're like technically different species by this concept, but also they can also technically have offspring. And then for me, when I saw species, I'm like, well, how are they going to talk about like different types of dragonborn, different types of elves? And then Emma, you brought up the whole thing about, well, are they going to bring in the idea of subspecies, which is so icky?
Well, it's funny. They use the term ancestry to talk about different types of dragonborn. That term's already in there, but I think they're using that for the subspecies or subrace thing. So like they have species as like the main word, and then they have ancestry beneath. And I think you could have ancestry on top and something like heritage. Or origin, which I know is a favorite term that you often go back to, Daniel, to replace those sort of subspecies, subrace, sort of categorizers that they end
I
up
like
defaulting to.
I like origin. So I like ancestry. I see no problem with them using what Paizo's already done, because race was like the thing that everyone was using. It's like, sure, we don't want to like copy another person and concede that they're doing it better, but why like settle on using something that's worse,
Yeah.
right? Like I saw the argument like, oh, they don't want to be like Pathfinder. I'm like, well, then they just shouldn't use D20s anymore. Let's
But they're,
completely
they're already using the term though. That's the
they're
thing.
already using the
Yeah.
term.
They're already
So
using the term.
I think that it should be
So-
ancestry. And then if you want like a sub ancestry, you could do origin. Because if you did origin, it would still align with like a sorcerer's draconic origin. Right.
Yeah.
If you align with that, like a sorceress origin, then the term can kind of still work. But the thing is, like, if they can make the change from race to species, anything else they use in D&D is subject to change. So if they're using ancestry elsewhere, change that to something different. I also like heritage, but I get what they're trying to do. They're trying to create categories. It's like what humans inherently do. It's we like to categorize things. We like to put them into boxes. But the exercise here is, how do we categorize things and minimize harm to others?
And like this would take some more thinking, but I was also thinking about how instead of when you want subcategories, the idea is that you have like major ones and then minor ones after. But why do we have to do that? Why can't everything recognized be at a particular level? This is going to be hard to explain. So every individual is an ancestry, and instead of making them subcategories of other ancestries, you go upward. So the grouping becomes higher order instead of subcategories. So like even a mixed character would be a particular ancestry.
Yeah.
They're their own thing. They are their ancestry.
Just have a bajillion different ancestries.
But they're part of they're part of multiple families. Like something above that, or multiple orders. So like
so
like
you
that,
would literally go into Linnaean taxonomy.
Yeah,
but just in
that's
terms.
the thing. Except instead of going
terms of-
downward, you go up. So it's like the elven order, and then there's elven families within it, and then there's ancestries that are within those.
Yeah,
and you never have to go into sub anything.
That's a good idea.
You could do like a class. Your class would be like immortals or something like that, and the order would be elves.
If you want to go with biological terms, that's what I would suggest: order, family, but then drop the species and do something that
like
recognizes that
they would have like
they're all sociocultural beings, that they're not just animals. Yeah,
that's the other thing. It's like it's very scientific. Very scientific.
So I have a question, and I've seen this on Reddit a couple times. There are people that do not like the term a species simply because they think it's out of place in a fantasy game. If this were a science fiction game or some sort of futuristic setting game, or if this were just like Spelljammer and aliens, what would you guys think about the usage of species? Because like Starfinder started using species.
They do that
just recently. If we're talking about like space adventures, alien life forms, how do you think that would influence this, if at all?
I think it's really a matter of
from an anthropological perspective.
I think it's really a matter of aesthetic, right? Because a lot of people associate, like, if they're like, oh, species sounds so sci-fi, it's associated with the genre of sci-fi. But the problem still remains, because you still have to clearly define what you mean by species. If you're like, this alien is a distinct species from whatever humans are, why? Tell me why.
Yeah.
My biggest fear with this is that because of D&D's roots in like medieval fantasy, their use of species, and even if they followed Linnaean taxonomy, like you had said, Emma, like kingdom, phylum, like King Philip comes class, order, family, all that stuff, because the acronym is King Philip comes over 4 great sects, is how I remember it.
I'm not suggesting we follow it strictly, but
no, but I like the idea of order. My fear is that if they do some sort of like hierarchy, they lean into that like chain of being concept from medieval Christianity, where they're like, there's like God and then angels, and then they
but then hierarchy doesn't have to go into it.
Yeah,
True.
That,
Yeah.
that kind of already exists in D&D with the planes, like celestials
Yeah.
and like heaven and hell and everything. So if they wanted to amp up the idea of the D&D multiverse, which they are doing in all of these products, the peoples of the D&D multiverse, we're getting a lot of talk about the various universes, everything everywhere all at once, that sort of thing. And so if they wanted to, they could already lean into the planar cosmology that D&D has always had and try doing something like that, but not leaning into the idea that we're all descended from a god and he is a supreme being, and there are certain beings and their respective families that are superior to others, which you often see in that in that historical context.
Yeah, that's my fear, is that they will enable players to take it too far, right? To enable players to like codify these sort of systems of oppression into their game. Another thing I noticed in the playtest document is that they also use the word culture. So
Right.
they use ancestry, origin, culture, and within like 3 paragraphs, they say life forms for a species. Also, they say sapient, which I feel like they will run into some issues down the line, given the origins of the term sapient. So species is a life form. It's an inherently biological thing.
Yeah, I'm interested in like the life forms. Like, what if you play like an undead character where you're
What if,
technically not alive?
what if, yeah, exactly.
Everyone wants to play like a vampire, like a dampier or whatever, and I don't know,
You
like
don't,
like
you
a
can't.
skeleton or a skeleton. I mean, I guess they could get around that by saying it has
It is imbued with
it is
life
imbued with
or
life
unlife. But like,
or
so they
unlife.
But
say
then
life
also,
forms.
then what is everything else? Like, yeah, they want sapient things, which is troubling, or sentient, we could even say, but even then it's like
What
what
is
is everything
life?
else? Like, what are all of the plants and the microorganisms and
Exactly. And I mean,
Yeah.
they also then say so they say sentient life form. So they say life forms, they say upbringing, training. But then they also go and they say cultures. But then all of that is actually removed from species. So when you say like, oh, you are an Ardling, one of these new ones, right? You could have like the tail of a squirrel. I figure you might like that. You can actually have a squirrel tail, but then
I don't need rules to let me do that.
you don't need rules
Yeah.
to do that. And it's like, okay, well, what is the culture of this? They have to put out a whole book on it. And then
Yeah.
what does it mean to pick this species? Honestly, this kind of backtracks into that bioessentialism for
It
me.
does. It reinforces like this idea of, phenotype, like outward appearance, but then also cultural and social traits, and everyone's messed up idea of genetics. And also species as a term is, you can't separate it from evolution, and evolution is also a fraught topic and category. So it's just making things
it makes things complicated, because if we were talking about evolution and like literally there was a response on Twitter that was like, well, Neanderthals and humans are distinct species, therefore I'm okay with this. I was like, thanks, white guy. But also like there's a lot of debate as to the fact that they are not distinct species.
It's not agreed upon.
And then what about like the Denisovians?
Yeah.
At the same time, it's like they haven't clarified what they mean by what defines the differences between them, right? Like, is it like simply just morphology? Because that can get real complicated as you go on. Because if you're like, well, if you're an Ardling, but then because of their adventurer traits, you can have like vestigial wings. Are Ardlings with wings different from Ardlings with squirrel tails? Like, are they different species? Are they subspecies? Like, this is the kind of discussion that I don't want to have when I'm making a character. I just want to say, hey, yeah, I have wings. Let's move on. I don't know. It just makes it more complicated. And I really am concerned that they're kind of leaning in on the fact that they said the term species was chosen in close coordination with multiple outside cultural consultants. I am really worried that they're basically using that as kind of like a, hey, we leaned in on a cultural consultant. They said that this was okay. And I don't like that. I'd really love to know who that individual is, like privately. I'd love to know who that person is, because like, what is their background? I know that most cultural consultants in the TTRPG space are typically folks who have history backgrounds. And I think if you are somebody with a history background and you're talking about something like this, you are missing out on the vast majority of the discourse around the term species. And I think that can get really complicated when you're introducing a game to people and asking them to say, create a character and then have them identify with or have them belong to a biological species. But we remove race because we don't want bioessentialism in this game. But you have to pick a life form to be and stick with it. It's weird. A sapient one. And then how do you justify half elves or half orcs? Because which definition of species are we sticking with? Are we saying that humans in Karator are different from humans on the Sword Coast if we're leaning in on like the reproductive isolation? Like, are the eco species? Because that's a term. I don't know. It makes things even more complicated. And I think
species is also just an ugly word.
It really
is. It's not
is
fun to look at or to say. Like,
can you imagine your session 0 when you're like, so what species are you? I see you're of the elven species.
Yeah.
What subspecies? Oh, the drow. Interesting. Good pick for your subspecies. It sounds icky. I don't like it.
It does make me wonder if they chose it because with One D&D or 6e or whatever you want to call it, they're trying to lean into more of like the cosmological multiverse side of D&D, and they want to establish like some new definition of species as it descended from like the creators of all of the planes of existences. Like it makes me feel like it's part of it was chosen as part of like I don't know, a bigger kind of rebranding of the lore of
honestly, in
D&D.
that case, I would have done origin. Like, what is your origin? I am this.
Yeah,
I'm an elf from this plane.
I do think there are possibly better choices out there that can sidestep a lot of these concerns, both the the icky historical context and both the like it kind of sounds like we're playing a sci-fi game now, like argument that a lot of people are going to make.
How many people do you think will actually drop D&D because it's too sci-fi now? I guarantee you there are going to be people who say that. But to wrap up, we are going to do an in-depth sort of episode of the podcast about this. But I want to know, Jeremy, I'll start with you. What would you have picked instead of species to replace race?
I would probably pick Ancestry or Origin. I like those. Or I would have gone completely JRPG with it and be like, tell me what your Octopath is, or like your yeah, something
just make
like
something
that.
up.
Yeah, like I would have made up some word like like Kingdom Hearts 2.5 squared, like something like that. I would have made up like a new word entirely. Like I don't know.
Sorry, you threw me off there. Tell me what your Octopath is.
Something like that. Triangle strategy. Like,
Triangle strategy.
That's the new combat system.
They call everybody travelers now. What,
yeah, everyone's a traveler.
Everyone's a traveler.
Choose your traveler path. Honestly, I like that.
Traveler path is like instead of class, it would be traveler path. I am the path of violence.
It's because like throughout the copy, they'd be like, these traveler paths have beards and they're called dwarves and they carry axes. And I would just, I mean, I'm always in favor of making
if you went like
a little more like
path,
a JRPG.
it was like, even if you did traveler path, it's like, what is your origin?
Yeah.
Well, here's my origin. And you could even make it more narrative too. I originated in like these mountains, and I like origin. I never thought about that one. But you're like you kind of like ancestry.
Yeah, ancestry, or I mean, I think heritage is currently. Is heritage used in 5e?
It's not.
They use lineage.
Yes.
So they could have used ancestry, maybe heritage, maybe origin, possibly Octopath, but they didn't.
Octopath.
Just throwing that out there.
Just throwing that out there.
Just throwing that out there.
Emma, what about you?
I personally think that the next edition of D&D should once again take a cue from Japanese games and just have a weird symbol like D&D, like and like an arrow, and it's pronounced D&D upper. Like that's my thing.
They're gonna do D&D and then just Roman numerals, and it's just gonna become Final Fantasy.
Yeah, it's just gonna D&D V-2. Like that's what it should be.
What about you, Emma?
I also think ancestry at this point is the best option because it's already been introduced, not just in D&D, but yeah, in other games, and people are familiar with it. And also I think in terms of broader connotations, it has that concept of both like a biological as well as the sociocultural lineage. Like it could combine the idea of like not just like who gave birth to you, but also where you grew up and what you picked up from them.
Yeah, it
So
takes
yeah,
the learned and the biological, because I don't
yeah,
think with the way D&D is structured, I don't think you can escape it. But I
yeah,
think there are ways in which you can address it more holistically. I personally also think like ancestry is the way to do it, right? You could some might argue for heritage. I like Octopath, but
yeah.
I really
Her-
like ancestry.
Heritage is a tricky term because it's become like an official institution in a lot of ways.
That's
true.
Like
Yeah,
World
that's
yeah.
Heritage
World
and all of
Heritage. Yeah,
that.
It's
It
complicated.
has more complications.
yeah, that's true. I didn't think of that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Archaeology.
Yeah. So I think
Yeah.
I think we're kind of we are all in agreement that ancestry is a great way of sort of encapsulating both the narratively biological, because they have removed those attribute score bonuses and they moved them to backgrounds. So I think that the narrative biological aspects and sort of the learned sort of cultural aspects of a character from like your upbringing. And then of course your training would be your class. But yeah, I just I appreciate you two joining me for just like quick reaction to this. Hopefully we could do more of this on Asians Represent. And if you folks are interested in learning more about just our thoughts on race and D&D in general, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. We do have a recent episode on the original One D&D sort of playtest material and how they address race and the idea of sort of mixed race characters. We've also got like 2 full episodes that both of you appear in on mixed race characters and the representation of mixed characters in fantasy media in general and beyond. But that said, thank you both for joining me, and I'm sure we will revisit this soon.